You know how everyone always says the Mongols were unstoppable? Like, they were this force of nature that steamrolled across half the planet. Entire kingdoms fell in weeks, cities burned to the ground, and rulers literally surrendered before a single arrow was fired. But here's the crazy part. There was a day when that unstoppable army got stopped. Not by an empire, not by some massive alliance, but by a group of warriors most people didn't even think had a chance. And the way they did it? Honestly, it's genius. They used a clever trick, a secret weapon that turned the Mongols' own game against them. And this wasn't just any battle. This was 1260, the Battle of Ain Jalut, the clash that shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility and changed the course of history forever. So today we're going to break it all down, who these underdog warriors were, what this secret weapon really was, and how one single fight proved that even the scariest empire in history could bleed. Alright, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll rewind a bit and see how the Mongols rose from nomads on the steppe to the most feared army on the planet. Then we'll look at the world right before Ain Jalut, the fall of Baghdad, the panic across the Middle East, and why Egypt became the last line of defense. After that, I'll introduce you to the Mamluks, who they were, why they were so unique, and how these former slave soldiers managed to stand toe-to-toe with the Mongols. And of course, we'll get to the good part, the secret weapon. The clever trick that flipped the script and turned the battle into a nightmare for the Mongols. Finally, we'll walk through the clash itself blow by blow, and see how this one fight didn't just save Egypt, but changed the course of history forever. By the end, you'll know exactly why Ain Jalut wasn't just another medieval battle, but the moment the Mongols finally proved they could be beaten. To understand why Ain Jalut mattered so much, you first have to understand who the Mongols were, and why everyone thought they couldn't be stopped. The Mongols started as scattered nomadic tribes on the harsh grasslands of Central Asia. Life out there was brutal. No cities, no farmland. Just endless steppe, extreme winters, and survival depending on your horse and bow. And then came Genghis Khan, the man who took these warring clans and forged them into a single, unstoppable war machine. What made them so terrifying wasn't just numbers, but the way they fought. Imagine armies across Europe and the Middle East used to slow-moving infantry, heavy knights in armor, clunky siege engines. And then, out of nowhere, here comes this swarm of horsemen moving like ghosts. They could ride for days without stopping, surviving off dried meat or even slitting a vein from their horse to drink its blood. And while doing that, they could fire arrows with deadly accuracy, at full gallop. Their weapon of choice was the Mongol composite bow, small, curved, and unbelievably powerful. Strong enough to punch through armor, light enough to use on horseback. A single Mongol warrior could rain down arrows faster than most foot archers, and there were thousands of them moving in perfect coordination. And it wasn't just the weapons, it was the strategy. The Mongols mastered psychological warfare. If a city resisted, they didn't just conquer it, they annihilated it. Entire populations wiped out, survivors deliberately left to spread horror stories. But if you surrendered, they often spared you and even absorbed your craftsmen, scientists, and siege engineers into their ranks. It was a brutal but brilliant system. Terrify your enemies before the fight even starts. Take Baghdad in 1258. At the time, it wasn't just a city. It was the jewel of the Islamic world, a hub of learning, medicine, and culture. When the Mongols sacked it, they burned libraries, destroyed centuries of scholarship, and massacred its people. Chroniclers wrote that the Tigris River ran black with ink and red with blood. After that, many rulers didn't even bother fighting. They just surrendered because resisting seemed like suicide. By the mid-13th century, the Mongols had built the largest continuous land empire in history, stretching from China all the way to the edge of Europe. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries collapsed in months. People whispered that the Mongols weren't even human, that they were God's punishment, the horsemen of the apocalypse. That was the reputation that marched toward Egypt in 1260. An enemy no one thought could be beaten. Which is exactly why what happened at Ain Jalut shocked the world. By 1260, the Mongol storm had already swept across Asia and the Middle East, leaving almost nothing standing in its path. Kingdoms collapsed one after the other, and the Islamic world was still reeling from the greatest shock of all, the fall of Baghdad just 2 years earlier. To put this in perspective, Baghdad wasn't just another city. For over 500 years, it had been the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars, poets, mathematicians, doctors, all worked under its patronage. It was the kind of city people thought could never fall. And yet, in just a few days, the Mongols reduced it to ash and silence. The Abbasid Caliph, the symbolic leader of the Muslim world, was executed. For many, it felt like the end of Islamic civilization itself. And the Mongols didn't stop there. After Baghdad, they pushed through Syria, taking Aleppo and Damascus with terrifying speed. These weren't minor towns. These were cities that had stood as crossroads of culture and trade for centuries. People fled in droves, carrying horror stories of slaughter and destruction. Entire populations scattered. Survivors arrived in Egypt with one clear message: the Mongols are coming, and they cannot be stopped. This is where Egypt enters the story. At the time, Egypt was under the control of the Mamluks, an elite military caste made up largely of former slaves trained as warriors since childhood. They were tough, disciplined, and fiercely protective of their new homeland. But even they knew the stakes. If the Mongols broke through them, there would be nothing left between the invaders and the Mediterranean. The entire Middle East, even North Africa, would be theirs. And to make matters worse, the Mongols had sent a letter to the Mamluks that dripped with arrogance. It basically said, "Submit or be destroyed like all the rest." The message was clear: Egypt was next. So imagine the tension. You're a soldier in Cairo at this time, hearing rumors of unstoppable horsemen who drink blood, who destroy entire cities in a day, who never lose. Your caliphate is gone, your neighbors are crushed, and now the storm is coming for you. That was the atmosphere in the lead-up to Ain Jalut. It wasn't just a battle waiting to happen. It felt like a last stand, the final hope to stop an empire that everyone else had failed to resist. Now, here's where the story takes a surprising twist. The defenders standing in the Mongols' way weren't ancient dynasties, powerful kings, or even long-standing empires. They were the Mamluks, a warrior caste unlike anything else in the medieval world. The word Mamluk literally means owned, because that's how their lives began. Most of them were boys bought or taken from regions like the Caucasus or Central Asia, often Turkic in origin. They were sold into Egypt as slaves. But here's the twist. Instead of living as servants or laborers, they were put through an intense, almost brutal system of training. From childhood, they were drilled in horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and military discipline. They grew up with nothing but war on their minds. And once they completed their training, they weren't treated like slaves anymore. In fact, they were freed and integrated into the military elite. For many, this was their only family, their only identity. Think about it like this. Imagine an army made up entirely of people who had been stripped of everything except their training. Men who had no wealth, no inheritance, no family name to fall back on. All they had was the sword, their brothers in arms, and their loyalty to the state that raised them. That was the Mamluk system. And by the time the Mongols came knocking, the Mamluks were running Egypt themselves. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They had overthrown their former rulers, seized the throne, and were now calling the shots. That means the entire country was being led by men who lived and breathed war. It also meant they were different from the armies the Mongols had faced before. These weren't noble knights tied down by feudal politics, or poorly trained levies forced to fight. The Mamluks were professionals, hardened warriors who knew the Mongol style of warfare better than most. Some of them even shared the same steppe heritage. So when people say Ain Jalut was a clash of titans, this is what they mean. On one side, the Mongols, the ultimate war machine of the 13th century. On the other side, the Mamluks, forged in fire, disciplined to the core, and with absolutely nothing to lose. So what was the secret weapon that the Mamluks used at Ain Jalut? It wasn't a fancy new catapult. It wasn't gunpowder. It wasn't even sheer numbers because, in fact, the Mongols still outmatched them in that department. The real weapon was something far more subtle and far more deadly: the feigned retreat. This was a move straight out of the steppe playbook. Ironically, something the Mongols themselves had used countless times to destroy their enemies. The trick was simple in theory but devastating in practice. You send a portion of your cavalry to pretend to break and run, luring the enemy into chasing them. And once your opponents stretch out and lose formation, you ambush them with hidden forces waiting in the wings. Now here's the genius part. The Mongols were so used to pulling off this trick on others, they never expected it to be used against them. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluks deliberately staged their forces so that part of their army looked weak and ready to flee. The Mongols, confident and eager, took the bait. They charged, certain they were about to crush another terrified foe. But instead of scattering, the Mamluks led them straight into a trap. Hidden reserves suddenly slammed into the Mongols from both flanks. The hunters had just become the hunted. And here's what makes this moment so important. It wasn't just about one clever tactic. It was about psychology. For decades, the Mongols had been the masters of deception, the ones who always controlled the battlefield with tricks like these. At Ain Jalut, for the first time, someone flipped the script. Someone out-Mongoled the Mongols. That's the real secret weapon. Not steel, not numbers, but strategy. September 3, 1260. The valley of Ain Jalut in modern-day Palestine. Dawn breaks, and two of the fiercest armies of the medieval world face each other. On one side, the Mongols under Kitbuka, one of Hulagu Khan's most trusted generals. Hardened cavalry, veteran archers, men who had ridden across Asia without ever knowing defeat. On the other, the Mamluks under Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant commander Baibars. Outnumbered, but disciplined, organized, and carrying a plan unlike anything the Mongols expected. The battle began in classic Mongol fashion. Kitbuka sent his heavy cavalry charging, confident they would shatter the Mamluk lines. The Mamluks, following their plan, gave way. The front ranks broke into retreat, or at least that's what it looked like. Dust rose, horses thundered, and to the Mongols, it seemed victory was already at hand. But then came the twist. As the Mongols surged forward in pursuit, the Mamluks' retreating cavalry suddenly wheeled around and stood their ground. At the same moment, hidden reserves that had been concealed in the surrounding hills, under Baibar's command, charged in from both flanks. The trap snapped shut. The Mongols, normally masters of battlefield trickery, now found themselves surrounded and squeezed into the narrow valley. Their famous mobility, the very thing that made them invincible on the open steppe, was suddenly useless. Arrows rained down on them, cavalry slammed into their sides, and chaos spread through their ranks. Kitbuka, refusing to flee, fought fiercely in the center. Contemporary sources say he fought until the end, refusing to surrender. But his defiance couldn't save his men. One by one, the Mongol formations collapsed under relentless Mamluk pressure. By midday, the unimaginable had happened. The Mongols were in full retreat. The Mamluks had not only stopped them, they had beaten them outright in open battle. And when Kitbuka was finally captured and executed, the message was clear. The age of Mongol invincibility was over. When the dust settled at Ain Jalut, it wasn't just another battlefield victory. It was the first time in history that the Mongols, the terror of the known world, had been decisively beaten in a full-scale engagement. For the Mamluks, the win was nothing short of transformational. Overnight, they went from being a relatively new ruling power in Egypt to the saviors of the entire Islamic world. Their reputation skyrocketed, and for the next 2.5 centuries, the Mamluk Sultanate would stand as one of the most powerful states in the region. For the Mongols, the defeat was devastating but also symbolic. Sure, they still controlled vast parts of Asia and the Middle East, but the myth of invincibility had been shattered. News of Ain Jalut spread far and wide. The Mongols could be beaten. And once people knew that, resistance across other regions became possible. It also had ripple effects on global history. Ain Jalut effectively saved the Middle East and North Africa from Mongol domination. If the Mamluks had lost, the Mongols would have had a clear path to the Mediterranean, and from there, who knows? Europe itself might have been exposed to yet another devastating Mongol invasion. And here's the kicker. This wasn't just about swords and arrows. It was about psychology. Ain Jalut proved that strategy, discipline, and timing could defeat sheer terror and brute force. The Mongols' aura of invincibility was cracked, and once that happened, they would never quite regain it. Centuries later, historians still point to Ain Jalut as one of the most important turning points of the medieval world. Not because it was the bloodiest battle the Mongols ever fought, but because of what it represented. For the first time, a force had shown that the Mongol war machine could be stopped in its tracks. That alone changed the psychology of warfare in the 13th century. No longer were the Mongols seen as an unstoppable tide sweeping across the map. They were human, they could be tricked, and they could be beaten. For the Mamluks, Ain Jalut became a cornerstone of their identity. They celebrated it as proof that their unusual system, soldiers born as outsiders, raised as warriors, then elevated to rulers, worked. It wasn't just luck. It was discipline, unity, and clever leadership that had won the day. And that narrative fueled their rule for generations. And when you think about the long arc of history, Ain Jalut's legacy becomes even clearer. If the Mongols had won, the Middle East as we know it might look completely different. Egypt could have fallen, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina might have been threatened, and even the trade routes connecting east and west could have shifted entirely. Instead, Ain Jalut drew a line in the sand. It said, this far and no further. That's why Ain Jalut isn't just remembered as another medieval battle. It's remembered as the moment the unstoppable empire finally hit a wall, and the world itself was spared from an even greater storm. So in the end, what destroyed the Mongol army at Ain Jalut wasn't some giant catapult or new piece of technology. It was something far more dangerous, a trick of the mind. The Mamluks didn't just fight with steel, they fought with strategy. They took the Mongols' own playbook, flipped it, and proved that even the most feared empire in the world could be outsmarted. And that's the real lesson of Ain Jalut. Empires don't fall because of size or numbers alone. They fall the moment someone dares to challenge the myth of their invincibility. The Mamluks dared, and in doing so, they didn't just save Egypt, they reshaped history. It's one of those rare moments where a single battle changes the course of the world. And it all came down to the courage to stand, the discipline to hold the line, and the cunning to turn fear into victory. If you enjoyed this dive into one of history's most dramatic turning points, make sure to check out our video on another epic battle topic you'll cover, e.g., how 5,000 Scots crushed England at Stirling Bridge. It's got the same mix of strategy, drama, and that one move that nobody saw coming. Thanks for watching, and as always, stick around, because history is full of secrets hiding in plain sight.